Today, I'd like to explore the interaction between the early modern humans and various pre-modern humans such as Neanderthals and Denisovans. I particularly want to take kind of a genetic look at it, but also I'll throw a little bit of fossil evidence in there just because that's the way I roll. One thing I want to particularly look for is evidence of admixture between modern humans and pre-moderns in various places. So at this point, what seems clear is that Neanderthals and moderns both descend from Homo heidelbergensis, and that they split somewhere around 500 to 800,000 years ago. After that split, Neanderthals probably evolved in Europe as a particularly cold adapted race of humans, while modern humans, being in Africa, seem to have evolved as pretty much a heat adapted race of humans. There were also, though, other descendants of heidelbergensis. Some of them lived in Asia. Maybe that's where the Denisovans come from. Maybe they're an Asian heidelbergensis or an evolutionary development out of the Asian form of heidelbergensis. So if we're looking at it genetically, what genomes do we have? Obviously we have modern humans. We also have Neanderthals. Pretty well understood. Genomes exist for more than 13 specimens dating in the time range between 40,000 and 70,000 years ago. So we know the Neanderthal genome pretty well. We have a genome from that finger bone at Denisova Cave, South Siberia, Russia. Or do I have that wrong and it was the tooth? Well, there's a finger bone and a tooth, and one of them yielded DNA and that was distinct from Neanderthal. The other one had Neanderthal DNA. And this genome dates between about 30 and 48,000 years ago. And we also have one genome of heidelbergensis from the Atapuerca site, one of the later ones at Atapuerca, the Cima de los Huesos cave of bones in Spain. That's more or less 400,000 years old, maybe a little less, 350 to 400,000 years old. So that's enough to do something with about figuring out the relationships between these critters on a level that's a little bit different from looking at the fossils, though I think you will probably come to the same conclusion I do, that what we gather from the fossil record and what we gather from the genetic record are pretty darn similar, with maybe a surprise or two thrown in there. So here's our preliminary cladogram basically on fossils, and I have this sort of pinkish highlighted fuzzy time area. We'll get back to that in a bit, but what's fuzzy about it is, well, actually this isn't the fossil evidence, this is the genetic evidence. What's kind of fuzzy about it is that 300,000 years here and 400,000 there, and that seems to reverse the time relationship. Oh well, we can just call it a fuzzy time area for now and hope that in the future more fossil and genetic evidence will help straighten that out. But something's going on between about 300,000 and 400,000 years ago that's interesting. Okay, so let me now add in the fossils. Sorry, I started with the genetic evidence. And now let me add in the fossils, which seem to fit fairly well. We can, put the older Heidelbergensis stuff like Homo antecessor down at the bottom here, older than 500,000 years ago. The genetic evidence comparing DNA of Neanderthals and moderns suggests that the split between Neanderthals and moderns occurred somewhere around 500,000 years ago, maybe a little earlier. But the older Heidelbergensis of Europe were there. Later European Heidelbergensis seem to fit about in here, and Neanderthals come off of them in some way. Timing for that split seems to suggest about 300,000 years ago. But then we've got the Heidelbergensis from Cima de los Huesos at Atapuerca that dates to 400,000, and the genetics suggests that it is more similar to Denisovans than it is to Neanderthals, which is, as we'll see, sort of a surprise. But then we can put the Asian Heidelbergensis here, and that works all right, and the African Heidelbergensis here, and that works all right. And everything works out pretty well, except for this business of the Cima Heidelbergensis being more similar to Denisovans over in Asia, South Siberia, than they are to Neanderthals, even though that site is in Europe. Well, some people have suggested that, the problem here is that we don't really know the primitive conditions. If the Heidelbergensis that we have the genome of actually has a lot of primitive conditions, which we would expect, and if those are shared also by the Denisovans, then what happens is the same thing that happens when you're looking at anatomy. It makes things look more related than what they really are. And some people think that might be what's going on here. I'm not sure how they figured out what the primitive conditions are, but I'm pretty sure that they didn't start with the assumption that the oldest fossil, being the Cima de los Huesos Heidelbergensis specimen, has the primitive condition. If they made that assumption, then things look different, and this specimen here, rather than being a branch off of Denisovans, becomes more like back here with European Heidelbergensis. And that seems like likely what's going to happen. That kind of means that this 300,000 to 400,000 years ago period of kind of fuzzy time relationships all of a sudden clarifies, and everything turns out right. So if that's actually what the issue is, I'm not too worried about it. Everything is as it should be, so to speak. Now, another thing revealed by comparing genomes of that Cima de los Huesos Heidelbergensis and Denisovans is that there's another lineage in there. There's a fourth type of hominin that we don't have yet. We barely have Denisovans, and we don't have this fourth lineage that contributed somewhere between 2.7 and 5% of the Denisovan genome. It's a lineage that seems to be older than the Cima de los Huesos hominins from Spain, maybe 1 million years old, and that points a finger at Homo erectus. So perhaps some contribution from Homo erectus directly into Denisovans was occurring over in Asia. So what the genes are telling us, what the DNA is telling us, I think, is that things are more complex than what we thought. There's a lot of complexity in there, and there is a lot of gene flow. Well, it depends on what you call a lot versus a little, but there's some gene flow among a lot of these hominins. So, the big question, did moderns and pre-moderns admix? And this is a hotly contested topic. It goes to the core of what we believe Neanderthals and Denisovans were. In other words, were they separate species, implying that they could not have mated and produced fertile offspring with a modern human, therefore there would be no admixture? Or are they just subspecies or incompletely speciated, capable of mating and producing fertile offspring with each other and with modern humans? And this is clearly the view supported by fossils and nuclear DNA. Mitochondrial DNA seems to suggest that they were separate species, but nuclear DNA in the fossil record detects some admixture. And so once again we have this question of, is there a syngamion going on there? Again, meaning some group of incompletely speciated populations that are still capable of some limited amount of gene flow, not a lot, 2 to 6% is not a lot, but it's some. And that seems to be more supported. Now, let's look at admixture from the viewpoint of the fossils. If there was admixture, let's say, between Neanderthals and modern humans, and of course that's what we're going to look at, because from the fossil sense, we essentially don't know Denisovans. We do know Neanderthals very, very well, and also Homo heidelbergensis. But one place we might look for possible admixture between Neanderthals and moderns is in the Middle East, because we know Neanderthals and moderns both were there. We know that they overlapped in time. They were both present on the landscape at the same time. They must have interacted with each other in some ways. And there are some sites in the Middle East where it looks like we have a very complex situation. There are some individuals there that look modern human, some that look Neanderthal, and some that look hybrid. And we've known about these for many, many years. The explanations for them have varied through time, depending on what was the fad, being the fad as far as how you viewed Neanderthals and moderns as being different species or the same species, or incompletely speciated populations. The idea that they were interbreeding there is actually very old. Some people have looked at it in terms of variability within a group. And others have looked at it more in terms of being a sort of a genetic crossroads. And as it is today, you have streams of gene flow coming up out of Africa and down out of Europe, and some coming from the East, from Asia as well, all having an impact on the Middle East. So it's just genes flowing and not necessarily Neanderthals and modern humans directly interbreeding. But still, if you have those genes flowing somewhere, someplace, Neanderthals and modern humans have to be intermixing to have that gene flow appear in the populations of the Middle East. The interbreeding explanation is now back in style because we have a couple of specimens from Europe that do seem to be fairly clearly hybrids, both in a genetic sense and an anatomical sense. Now, the Middle Eastern sites, Kafse. Okay, on the very left there we have Kafse 9. And I think that it's pretty clear, should be pretty clear to everybody, from the small brow ridges, the chin, the nice round skull, that that's a modern human. Dates to about 90,000 years ago. And then we have Kafse 6 from the same site, dating about the same time. It's the one in the middle here. And that's pretty clearly a Neanderthal. Big brow ridges. We don't have the mandible, but that sort of long, low skull that pins it as a Neanderthal. At a nearby site in Shkul, also these are all in Israel, we have Shkul 5, for example, that seems to combine features of both. It's got sort of a modern human skull shape, but pretty pronounced brow ridges, has a chin. Is it modern? Is it like a Homo sapiens idaltu? You know, the more clunky, chunky early modern humans that we find in Africa, or is it a hybrid? And until, if we can look at some genetics, it's really hard to tell for sure. Well, here's one of those two sites in Europe, Riparo de Mezzana. Pardon me, I don't speak Italian. Pardon me if I'm mispronouncing that. Maybe it's Mezzana, I don't know. It's a cave in Italy. Produced a partial jaw, about 40,000 years old. This is the period of time when you had both modern people and Neanderthals in Europe. It has a chin. That's the important thing about it. That says it's modern human. It's also, you know, the size and the shape. It's kind of smallish and gracile, not the big clunky ones of Neanderthals. So anybody would classify this as a modern human jaw. But it does have several traits of Neanderthals as far as the positioning and sizes of the teeth. And when you look at the genetics, the mitochondrial DNA is Neanderthal, suggesting that this person's mother was a Neanderthal, or at least some female ancestor was a Neanderthal. Lagarvelho in Portugal, there's a child that's been suggested to date to about 24,500 years ago and be a possible mix of modern and Neanderthal. What looks modern about it? Well, it's pretty gracile, but this sort of forward protrusion of the face in this area is pretty distinctly Neanderthal. Especially, this is about a 4-year-old child, especially at that age, they shouldn't have protrusion. A modern human child won't have protrusion of the nose and jaw region in that area. Possible hybrid there as well. Some more admixture evidence from the fossils. Eric Trinkhaus reviewed the fossils of the earliest modern humans in many regions. Of course, in Europe it's the most clear because of the many fossils, many sites, and very good dating. And he showed that many of them have unique sort of combinations of primitive and derived features that do suggest some Neanderthal admixture. The Gravettian peoples of Europe, for example, that date to about 33,000 years ago, are more clunky, chunky, Neanderthalish than, say, the Cro-Magnons from 26,000 years ago, which could fit within the populations of Europe today. Well, let me say the issue's not resolved based on the fossil record. The debate will continue about whether any of these, all of these, some of these, none of these are actual hybrids of Neanderthals and moderns. But the genetic evidence is more clear. So let's take a genetic view of it. Do modern people have pre-modern genes? In other words, do we today have any genes from Neanderthals or Denisovans? Again, we'll focus on Europe and the Middle East for the obvious reasons. And again, that brings us back to a couple lectures back where we talked about the Afro-European sapiens hypothesis versus recent African origins hypothesis, the out of Africa versus mostly Africa points of view that differ in whether Neanderthal genes exist in modern human populations. So let's start with the mitochondrial DNA evidence that says very clearly there's no genetic contribution from Neanderthals in modern humans. Now remember, mitochondrial DNA is that DNA that's passed down in the mitochondrial bodies within the cell. It's not the chromosomes, that's the nuclear DNA. And it has an advantage in that it gives a simple picture. So how can I express that? Okay, if you're looking at your chromosomes, you're getting a contribution from both mother and father. So you have two parents, they had mothers and fathers, so you have 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, 16 great-greats. Yet if you're looking at the mitochondrial, only your mother matters. So in your parents' generation, you have one mother. In your grandparents' generation, you have one mother's mother. Your great-grandparents, you have one mother's mother's mother. And so in every generation, there's only one ancestor, as opposed to this sort of geometrically increasing number of ancestors when you're looking at the chromosomal DNA. So it gives a simple picture. But that's the strength of mitochondrial DNA work. It does have a disadvantage, as I'll talk about in the next slide. So one thing we can do with the mitochondrial DNA evidence is we can use a molecular clock approach and ask, when did moderns and Neanderthals split and never admix according to this evidence? And that time turns out to be somewhere around 400 to 600,000 years ago. Okay, now, why might the mitochondrial DNA evidence be wrong? Well, remember, it's only about female relatives. So the common model for gene flow from one group to another is what's called the Sabine scenario. It comes from the ancient, I think, Greek story of the Sabine women. And the idea is that conquered females are saved as wives. So the conquerors come in, they kill off all the males, they take the women home and they become their wives, maybe sex slaves, who knows, we can apply lots of words to that. But anyway, the females remain in the population and form a generation of mothers. If it works that way, then mitochondrial DNA would tell the story and it would be right. But there's an alternative scenario called the American scenario that comes out of the contact between Europeans and Native Americans in the Americas, where the pattern of gene flow is from males of a conquering group to females of the conquered group. So when Europeans came to the Americas, yeah, obviously they conquered the Native Americans due to their better technology, but they didn't take the females home to be their wives, quote unquote. And, you know, of course, as always happens in wartime, considerable amount of rape and so forth occurred. So women did have children from fathers that were European, and but what happened to those children? They tended to stay in the Native American groups. Some exception to that, you've got Pocahontas, right? You all know the Pocahontas story. And Pocahontas, probably more than 1 million people in the U.S. have some trace of genes from Pocahontas. How many have her mitochondrial DNA is not known. But so if, let's say, modern humans were passing their genes into Neanderthals, because we assume that they're winning, if they're fighting at all, then those mixed children would stay with the Neanderthals, and when the Neanderthals disappeared, so did those mixed children. So, if it worked that way, there would be few Neanderthal genes in modern females, and the mitochondrial DNA evidence could be wrong. More reasons. There might be Neanderthal genes in males that wouldn't show up in mitochondrial DNA because we don't get any mitochondrial DNA from our fathers. And there's been considerable pruning of the mitochondrial DNA tree. So I had four great-grandmothers, but only one of them, my mother's mother's mother, passed on her mitochondrial DNA to me. So anytime a female has all sons, her mitochondrial lineage stops at that generation. And that means that there are many, 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 many mothers in the past that didn't actually pass on their mitochondrial DNA. So another thing, some people suggest that male hybrids were less fertile. You see this sometimes in studies of hybridization in baboons and other monkeys and other types of mammals, that when you have hybrids that females tend to be more fertile than the males, that's really for things that are probably more completely speciated than what Neanderthals and modern humans were. But anyway, it's been suggested that the male hybrids were less fertile and maybe that has an impact, but to me that seems a little bit silly, because if the males are infertile, then that means that the female signature through mitochondrial DNA should show up more strongly rather than less strongly. Okay, now let me give you an example of a genetic pattern that indicates admixture. And actually, so you might ask the question, how do we recognize when admixture has occurred from the genetic point of view? And I'll give you an example here from the nuclear genome, the chromosomes, chromosome 17 actually, the MAPT, or microtubule associated protein tau. I have no idea what that is, by the way, not enough of a biochemist for that, but anyway, it's a protein found in the body. It has two types, H1 and H2. Most people in the world have H1, but H2 is found in many Europeans. It's most common in Scotland and Germany, and it probably entered the modern population of Europe 10,000 to 30,000 years ago, so is said. But when did it split from the H1 type that's found everywhere else in the world? And that was perhaps as long ago as 500,000 years. So if H2 split from from H1 500,000 years ago, and everyone pretty much in the world has H1, except for a few Europeans, where did those Europeans get it? It had to have been handed down through those intervening years, some way in Europe, and entered the modern human population later. But who could have passed that on? No other modern humans from outside Europe have it. So it must have been somebody who descended from Homo heidelbergensis separately from all the other modern humans of the world other than Europeans, and that means the Neanderthals. So that's the kind of pattern excuse me, that you look for when you're looking for genetic evidence of admixture, is things that have split a long time in the past and could have come to modern humans by no other means other than being passed from Neanderthals or Denisovans or whatever. So in 2010, they sequenced the Neanderthal genome, and applying the molecular clock, it suggests that Neanderthals and moderns split about 500 to 800,000 years ago, maybe a little earlier than what's suggested by the mitochondrial DNA, but fairly comparable. And it shows that all of the peoples in the world, except Africans, have 2 to 4% Neanderthal DNA. So I'm a good example of that. I think I told you before I had my DNA quantified last year, and I'm 2.7% Neanderthal. It's about average for peoples of Europe. Right in the middle of this range. They found over 600 loci that follow the same sort of pattern as that MAPT locus that I talked about in the last slide. Now, how do you have everyone in the world other than Africans having this trace of Neanderthal admixture? Well, that admixture couldn't have occurred in Africa. It had to have occurred outside of Africa. The fact that both Europeans and Asians have it suggests that it had to occur before Europeans and Asians split. And that points back to the Middle East and that sort of complex period of time between 90 and 40,000 years ago, where you have moderns and then Neanderthals and then both and so on and so forth. And you find some things that look like there may be hybrids like at Schule, and that seems to be a pretty good guess as to when and where it occurred, somewhere in the Middle East, maybe 60,000 years ago, thereabouts. Now, what about the Denisovans? They have some contribution too. Comparison to modern human DNA shows about a 6% contribution from Denisovans to some surprising populations, the peoples of Australia, the Philippines, and Melanesia. Clear out there off the coast of Asia, they get pretty high Denisovan admixture. Mainland Asians have a tiny bit, 0.2% of Denisovan admixture. They have more Neanderthal admixture than Denisovan, but these folks, Australia, Philippines, and Melanesia, up to 6%. So that suggests that the Denisovans represent a really widespread species. We find them in southern Siberia, but they obviously had to be down in Southeast Asia too in order to contribute in this substantial way to the ancestry of Australians and the Philippines and the Melanesian islands, and that they mix there, 50, 60,000 years ago with early modern humans. So here's kind of a tentative map, sort of a modern consensus map of how the migrations from, it's a simplified map, I guess is the word I'm looking for, of how the migrations of early modern peoples out of Africa occurred. And you see that they're going up into the Middle East, and there we're pretty sure there's a point of Neanderthal admixture. Some of them go up into Europe where it's questionable. The MAPTH2 allele suggests that there was at least a little bit independently in Europe, not from anywhere else. And then we've got Denisova up here, but they must have had, Denisovans must have been living down through here, and some admixture with Denisovans down here, less admixture up here in Asia, and again questionable whether it actually occurred there, or whether it's just sort of back gene flow from what happened down here in these islands. Okay, what other types of evidence can we look at? Turns out we can look at head lice. Human beings' constant companion for many, many thousands of years, so let's even say millions of years. Actually, there are two lineages of human head lice that split from each other about 1.2 million years ago. Again, that's based on a molecular clock estimate. That's a little earlier than when Heidelbergensis first appears in Europe. It may record a split between Erectus and Heidelbergensis. And the distribution of these lice lineages is interesting in that lineage 1 is found everywhere, perhaps through evolution from Heidelbergensis, but lineage 2 is only found in the Americas, which, if these two lineages split 1.2 million years ago, then when those Asian peoples that were to be the ancestors of the peoples of the Americas, they must have somehow touched Homo erectus that might have been carrying lineage 2. Doesn't mean they had sex with them. That's not pubic lice. It means they touched them and got some head lice. And that's all it takes for head lice. So, an interesting suggestion that Homo erectus is around in there too. Skin color genes have an interesting pattern to them. Now, when we have the Neanderthal genome sequence, so we know something about their genes, and one thing that we know is that they had light skins and often had red hair, which is why all the modern reconstructions of them show them with red hair. They didn't all have red hair, but a lot of them did. However, these are not the same genes for light skin and red hair that we find in modern European peoples. They're different genes. And in fact, now we know that the European peoples remained dark-skinned until surprisingly recently, only 11 to 19,000 years ago, they evolved lighter skins using a different set of genes than what the Neanderthals had. In other words, Europeans didn't get their light skins from the Neanderthals. It was the wrong genes. They evolved it separately. Some people think that this change to a lighter skin color in Europe actually didn't occur until about 8,000 years ago. I don't know what you're upset about. No, settle. So now, what about those Neanderthal light colored skin genes? Interestingly, they're found in some Asian populations, which suggests some admixture from Neanderthals to moderns in Asia that didn't occur in the same way, at least in Europe. Now, there's a lot of recent, I think, kind of speculative studies about what's the effect of the Neanderthal admixture in modern humans. And some studies focus on sort of the negative effects, others focus on more positive effects, some the combination of both. I think this is a positive effect. Study of the HLA white blood cells, human leukocyte antigen. Leukocytes are white blood cells. It's involved with the immune system. You can also call this system of cell types the major histocompatibility complex, reflecting the fact that really it's found in all tissues. And for example, when they do organ transplants, you have to match these cell types or you're going to get rejection if you don't match them very closely. And so what we find is interestingly, about half of the modern human white blood cell and other tissue type antigens come from Neanderthal or Denisovan sources, and therefore you can argue that this admixture strengthened the modern human immune system, that our immune system is not just 2.7% Neanderthal and tiny bit of Denisovan, unless you're from Australia or some islands there. It's half. And so it must have been pretty strongly selected for. So it must be that Neanderthals and or Denisovans acquired pretty good immune systems before the modern humans got there. And then admixture passed some of that on. Now here's kind of a downside. Some cancers are caused by genes called oncogenes. That means a cancer-causing gene. Those genes appear generally when a virus copies its DNA into its host DNA. So it's actually viral DNA that's been copied into, say, a human genome. And at least some of those oncogenes were inherited from Neanderthals, suggesting that some of our cancers are a legacy from Neanderthals. So it went both ways, as admixtures tend to do. And that's all for today.